It's a cliche on this side of the table to say that our immigration system is broken. But when you hear the testimony of these 5 witnesses, you can't reach any other conclusion. From one end of the table to the other, you have given us a litany of failings of our current immigration laws. And sadly, most of those failings that you've talked about really relate to innocent and vulnerable young people who were caught up in a circumstance that was not their choice and whose lives are at stake in the process many times over. That is the reality. Ms. Bradley, thank you, you and your family, for reaching out to help so many others. The 2 daughters that you've adopted, can both of them now legally work in the United States?
They can. Thanks to our Congresswoman, we were able to push through their employment authorization cards so that they didn't expire. So they are both eligible to work full. Yeah, one of them has a job. She's worked for 2 years. And the other one is able to work at a salon as soon as she signs a contract. So yes.
As you mentioned, they do not qualify for many government programs that other children may be eligible for. At this point, do you see them? Let me ask you, what is their immigration status at this moment?
At this point, they have a special immigration juvenile status, which they got when they came into foster care. It was approved by a judge, and they applied for their green cards in December 2021, and we just have to wait 3 to 8 years for that to come.
I hope
that's
it's
their
only
current
8
status.
years.
Yeah.
Ms. Davidson, you talked about attorneys representing these young people and said they don't all have legal counsel. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay. Do they have any representation at all?
So sadly, most children do not, and we want to make sure that kids have
You can
access.
get closer to the
Yeah,
microphone.
sorry.
That you appreciate.
Most children do not have legal counsel, and it's so important because it helps them comply with their immigration case, but it also gives them that trusted adult relationship to make sure that they have someone that they can talk to if they're concerned about their rights.
What about the phenomena that I've heard described where it's difficult to have a sponsor or even a member of the family to step forward because they're worried because of their own immigration status of identifying themselves to the government to unite with the children? Have you run into that situation?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, particularly under the last administration, when it was made clear that sponsor information would be used against them in immigration enforcement. So it is really difficult for sponsors to come forward. And we want these kids to comply with their immigration case because that's what they're guaranteed a right to have their case heard before a judge.
Ms. Basham, this sexual trafficking and sexual abuse that takes place, I mentioned earlier that I met with some of the migrants that were sent to Chicago from Texas when the governor decided to send them up, and sat down with them for several hours to talk about their experiences. There were no children involved in this interview process, at least of an age that they could tell me much. But I do recall a young woman who was about 30 years old who could have sat at this panel and looked like she was at home. She was a college graduate who made that trip to the U.S.-Mexican border, and she clearly was raped in the process. So the worst case, obviously, is child sexploitation, but it happens, obviously, at many different levels, and yet they still make the journey, knowing that danger lies ahead. I couldn't agree with you more that we have to find a way to educate, as President Obama tried with his statement, the families in these other countries about the dangers if they try to make this journey. What more do you think we could do at this point?
So that's a question that takes a lot more than 40 seconds to answer, but I'll tell you one of the things that's currently in Congress that will help right now is, I know TVPA is controversial, but there's a portion of the Frederick Douglass Trafficking Victims Protection Act that should be introduced shortly, and it deals with prevention education. And I will tell you that if when it comes to human trafficking, the biggest gap is in victim identification. Less than 1% of victims are ever identified, and if in general we had more prevention education and more children were able to come forward themselves and self-identify, if more teachers were able to identify, we would see a dramatic result throughout the country. So I think that's one legislative fix that's actually currently going to be in Congress shortly.